Third John is similar to Second John, which we covered last week. They're attributed to being written at near the same time, same style. It's the form of a personal letter. And as we will see, it's even similar in content. So let's go ahead and jump right into 3 John 1, verse 1. So 3 John 1. It says, "To the elder, to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth." So we're introduced already to two of the characters in this narrative, two of the 4 people that we're going to see. Of course, the elder, we quoted 1 Peter 5:1 last time, that, again, they're all an elder, all the apostles even. Peter calls himself an elder in 1 Peter 5:1. And we discussed that somewhat at length last time as well, so I won't belabor that point. But it is written by John to Gaius. Now, Gaius apparently was one of the most common names at that time and in that area. In fact, there's 3 other ones that are mentioned in the New Testament, which I don't believe to be this Gaius in particular. There were other ones, they were mostly around Paul's time. One of them was Paul's traveling companion. One was called Gaius of Derbe. And this is more than likely being written to the people of Ephesus. And then there was another Gaius of Corinth that was baptized by Paul, and there was a Gaius that was Paul's host. Now, one of the main reasons, other than you can't make the connection and the fact that the name is popular, is that when Paul was writing, this is some 30 to 40 years ago. So, not to say that it couldn't be, that there were by any stretch of the imagination, but the likelihood that the name was so popular and they were separated by 3 to 4 decades leads us to believe that this is a different Gaius. Now, John calls him beloved Gaius. And of course, this is high praise coming from the one that Jesus loved, right? This is how John described himself in his own gospel account. You can put John 13, verse 23 there if you would like. But he has this love for Gaius. He sees Gaius in a certain way. And he's going to start describing that, how Gaius is and how Gaius acts for, the first, about 2/3 of the chapter. And he's doing this for a reason. He's saying, okay, this is a good example. This is the way to be. Anyway, to finish off the first verse, he says, love in truth, right? John loved him in truth, in the church, in the right way, as a spiritual love. Now, this is also similar to the way he began 2 John 1 and verse 1. Now, there's some who believe that, there's this kind of affair going on between John and the elect lady, whom I love in truth. But here he is saying it to Gaius. And as we proved it last time and showed last time, again, it's a very above board. This is a very spiritual letter, and it's on that level that he is saying this and that he's communicating. So now continuing in verse 2, "Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers." So John sees these things within the purview of God to grant, and that is to prosper in all things. So physical blessings, such as prosperity. Now, he also wants them to keep this in perspective, as Timothy is also urged to do. Not just Timothy, but everyone. In 1 Timothy 6, verses 17 through 19, again, we're just showing here that God is not against people being rich or being blessed. In fact, this is what he wants. And there's a direct correlation, as we're going to bring out here in just a bit. But in 1 Timothy 6, verse 17, it says, "Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who gives us richly all things to enjoy." So don't think of yourself more highly than you should just because you have money or wealth or material goods, because those things are, in many senses, fly by night. People can lose them in a heartbeat, and then what? If that's where you put your trust, then it's all gone. He says, "Let them do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share." So he's saying, Yeah, you still need to continue to do good and also use these riches, okay? But use them in good works, okay? You be ready to give and to share and to help. If you do that, verse 19, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life. So he says you need to be doing the right thing with your riches, those who have riches. And if you do, then you're going to lay hold of the more important thing, which is eternal life. So you have the temporary, this life, but you need to focus on the more important, which is the spiritual, which is eternal. Now, God's not against prosperity. He just wants us to be able to handle it. Go ahead and put Psalms 35:27 in your notes. And it says, let the Lord be magnified, who has pleasure in the prosperity of his servant. He's more than happy. He wants you to have these things. In fact, Isaiah 48:17 says, who teaches you to profit. It says, I am the Lord your God who teaches you to profit, who leads you by the way that you should go. He's going to lead you in this path. He's going to lead you in this way if you can handle it. And he also teaches that there is a cause and effect. All right? So Deuteronomy 29 verse 9 says, keep the words of this covenant and do them, that you may prosper in all that you do. So these covenants, these agreements that the people had with God, that they said that they would do, God says, if you do those things, I will do these things. He says, I will bless you. And what are those things? You know, not just the covenant, but what the covenant was based on. In 1 Kings 2 and verse 3, it says, keep the charge of the Lord your God to, okay, what is the charge of the Lord your God? To walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgment, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses. Okay, if you do those things, then it goes on, that you may prosper in all that you do wherever you turn. So again, God is not against people being rich or wealthy. He just wants them to do what he commands, to live by every word. And as you go through the Bible, you can see that some of the richest men of all time were godly men. You know, I was reading about some of David's wealth to just, I was just reading at that time, but then I looked it up on the internet at that time and said, well, wonder where David would appear on the list of the wealthiest men of all times. Because I went through, and if you go through and calculate it, even by today's numbers, and at the time, I think one of the things that prompted me was because gold was at this all-time high, and I was reading how much gold David had. And in this one case, it was showing how much he had set aside for the temple. Okay, this is just what he was donating. And so I actually recalculated it just yesterday and saw that he put aside $220 billion in terms of today's prices of gold and silver, right? And that doesn't include the bronze, the marble, the expensive woods, the onyx, the other precious stones, the brass, so on, and stuff that he gave beyond number. And even later he goes and gave more gold and silver, very high gold, high quality gold from Ophir, and silver. So this is what he set aside to give for the temple. Now, of course, David wasn't even on the list because some people don't even think King David had existed in the past. And since then, I know that they have found some archaeological evidence, but it never even crossed my mind that he didn't exist. But nonetheless, that's how rich he was. And others like Abraham, right? He was going to be blessed with descendants that multiply as the stars of heaven, and that all his seed in the nations shall be blessed. And so why? Why was this done? Well, because Abraham obeyed God's voice and kept his charge, his commandments, his statutes, his laws. You know, another one was Job. You know, at the beginning of Job, it says, you know, that he had so many sheep, camels, oxen, etc. And of course, he went through all the lessons that he had to go through, and he lost all this stuff. Okay, so is this where Job had his main focus? Well, no, I think God did that to get his attention, said, okay, here it all is. But that lesson, the spiritual lesson, was that much more important. So he got his attention. But if you notice at the very end of the chapter, he gave him back twice as much as that he had in the beginning. And he blessed his health too. So, Job lived to be 140 years old, and he saw his children and grandchildren for 4 generations. So he was truly blessed. But we also see, one, he could handle it. 2, that God's not opposed to taking it away, and that he then gave it to him once he knew that the other lesson was learned and more important. And Job was one of these guys that was very rich. And it goes on. Again, I bring out the health part because that was part of this verse here. And that is that you be in health. So you prosper in all things, be in health. Again, God can protect us and keep us from harm. He can heal us whenever we become sick. When we call on the elders, he gives us all these means for doing this. He shows us how to live a healthy and prosperous life. And this is what God wants. He wants us to choose the right thing. And he goes on, just as your soul prospers. Again, he's talking about their life. He wants them to prosper with their life. So moving on to verse 3, he says, "For I rejoice greatly when brethren came and testified of the truth that is in you, just as you walk in the truth." So once again, just like 2 John, he's focusing in on the truth. I think he mentions it 4 times in the first 4 verses, and then mentions it a couple other times as we go through. It was that important. It is this important. When you stop and look at the truth, most people don't have the truth. There's a sound mind that comes with the Spirit of God in reading the Bible. And when you study the Bible, you learn the truth. It's not even just a biblical/religious type of truth. It's a truth in so many ways about the world around us and what's in the world. And the world does not understand these things. And so they lack the truth to a great degree. I mean, when you look at it, a lot of people just don't know the truth about anything. And it seems to be becoming more pervasive, this idea that people are losing the truth, don't have the truth, don't understand the truth, don't see it, and don't know it. So John, when he's going through this epistle, he's bringing out the point that, okay, it's paramount that you not only know the truth, but that you live the truth. Again, you can't live the truth unless you know the truth. Those two go hand in hand. But it's incumbent upon those who know the truth to then live by it, because you're going to be held accountable for it. So he goes, the brethren came and they testified of the truth. So it was common for the brethren, the brothers in Christ, to carry the news from church to church. And the word that they brought back to John was very encouraging. It made him very joyful. Now John was about 90 years old, give or take 10 years at this time. He was their spiritual father figure. He had this vested interest in their well-being, of course, like a father would. But again, this was a labor of love, the things that John was doing of God, the way that he was living his life. This was what it was all about, and it had all been about for the last 60, 70 years or more. And he had taught them. So he greatly rejoiced. He rejoiced greatly as a teacher. It was one of the greatest rewards that you can have as a teacher, is when a student or a disciple, which is what disciple means, learns or comprehends what you're saying, and they show this primarily by doing correctly what you say. And so John's saying exactly this of Gaius. He says, "I've heard that you know the truth and you're living according to it." Gaius believed what he had been taught, and he's holding fast to it, and he's using it in his daily life. John is saying what a good guy Gaius is. But then he says that this is the way he feels about anyone who does this. So in verse 4, he says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in the truth. John saw them as his spiritual children, can we say? The ones that he had nurtured and brought up. I mean, this is not uncommon in the New Testament that they say it like this. In fact, Paul said the same thing. In Galatians 4:19, he says, my little children for whom I labor in birth again until Christ is formed in you. That's in Galatians 4:19, Paul is saying that. And then, he says over in 1 Corinthians 4:15, he says, for in Jesus Christ, I'm just breaking into the verse, I have begotten you through the gospel. He says, yet you do not have many fathers, for in Jesus Christ, I have begotten you through the gospel. So in this sense, he's their father figure too. He's the one that's nurturing them through from conception till the end, if either one of them should live that long. And he sees them as his church. And it's an endearing term. It's a term of endearment. One that, the way that he sees them, the way he wants to treat them and act, and the way he feels that his job takes him. So it's not completely uncommon to use this perspective, and it fits with the job that they were doing. But what we see here is John is subtly doing and saying something here. One, he's bringing the rest of the congregation into this letter that he sent. Also, he's saying, if you act like Gaius and walk in the truth as he does, I'm going to be pleased with you as this spiritual father figure in the flesh. Now, John continues this setup for the main reason that he is writing the letter. He's not simply saying these things in the first 4 verses to conform to some type of protocol for salutations, but rather he's leading up to the crux of the matter. So what we see now is that John's changing gears after the first 4 verses, and in this next section, verses 5 through 8. And he says he has faith that Gaius will do what's right in the upcoming situation. Now keep in mind that this letter is going to be passed around so that the rest of the congregation has a good reason now to read the letter. They're mentioned in it. He calls them his children. He says he greatly rejoices when they're doing well. And so here Gaius is seeing this. And of course, I think Gaius probably knew that the letter was for everybody, and they probably passed it all around anyway, because it wasn't as prolific to be able to send a message to people like we have the ability to do today. But now they're going to read it because they're in it, but they're going to see these things, and they're going to now understand the more important nature of the letter. And that is what is going to be covered here in the next, from here on out to pretty much the rest of the chapter. But I think when going through this, as you go through it and you study it, you and you got to study it over and over, and you go through it again, you put it all together, you start to kind of see the mind of John. You see what John was thinking, why John was writing this, how he was writing it in a very, I'll say, clever, loving, kind of subtle way. And again, it was this form of this personal letter to Gaius. But nonetheless, he is saying everything for a reason. And when you go back and you look at this, you can't just look at it. Again, we are always encouraged to study the Bible, not just read the Bible, but to study it, to ask questions, to put things together. And when you do, you start seeing, okay, why John is saying things and why he says them the way that he says them. Okay, there's more to it than meets the eye, especially on the first run through. So now, beginning in verse 5, he says, Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers. So he's speaking directly to Gaius once again, who he called beloved up in verse 2. He says, you do faithfully. So he's exemplified Christianity through his interactions with the church people, both in and out of the church area, right? So he goes, whatever you do for the brethren, right? Again, this is what we're called to do. Galatians 6:10 says, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. So it's to everybody, but especially to the brethren right here. So he's saying, do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers. Now, here's the thing. This is worded a little bit awkwardly, and John is saying that Gaius treated church members that were strangers and guests in his area, and he treated them well. All right, so it's not strangers that nobody knows, they're just coming into town or passing through town, or that are not in the church. But he's saying that these brethren and strangers are in the church, and he has faithfully done what he is supposed to do towards them. Now, what we're going to see by the context of the verse before and these ones that are coming up afterwards, in verse 3 he says, he greatly, I rejoice greatly when brethren came and testified of the truth. All right, so he had brethren that were there before who came, and John, they told John of how Gaius was. But we go on to verse 8, and it's even stronger as we go through this. We'll see it even in the verses before verse 8 to a certain degree. But John calls the ones that Gaius sent forth, he said that they were fellow workers. So when we're talking about these people, these quote-unquote strangers, they were these visiting or traveling ministers that were indeed church members, but you didn't know them before. So they were going to the local congregation for a visit and to help out and to preach and teach. And John was saying that Gaius treated them very well. So going on, we're going to see this as we go, but I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a heads up. But just to make clear that it was the way, because this is very important for the rest of the letter as well, and the point that he's getting into, that when the strangers came into the congregation, the one that you just didn't know, but they were members of the church, he treated them well. So continuing in verse 6, again, the context is the brethren and the strangers who have borne witness of your love before the church. So now, again, this makes what I was saying about verse 3, about the brethren who came and testified. Verse 6 is saying, okay, it was these brethren and strangers who have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, you will do well. So they came and they testified, and they told John and the congregation there of the love that Gaius had for the people of God. Then he goes, okay, you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God. Now, this might seem a little strange for John to say this kind of out of the blue, but he's instructing and he's leading up to the main point. So implied here is that you're receiving these traveling ordained men properly. You're being hospitable. You're sending them on to the next congregation in the best possible way. So the word here in the Greek can even have the connotation that you accompany them on their way. You're helping them in this way with their preaching of the gospel. And then he says, you will do well. So John's encouraging Gaius to stay the path, saying, if you do all of this in the way that you should, in the way that I've heard you have been acting, then you're doing a good work and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Then verse 7, he says, because they went forth for his name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles. So again, these strangers, okay, they went forth, these traveling elders, ministers, traveling prophets, whatever they were, exactly it does not say, but what we do is that they were traveling and they were sent forth. They went forth. So this is where we get that strong indication that they were actually these traveling ministers, not just visitors going from place to place, but they were going out to preach the truth, the gospel of Christ for his name's sake. All right, so it says that in verse 7, his name's sake. And it's an obvious indirect reference to Christ. Now we have to ask why it was an indirect reference. Why didn't he say for, the name of Christ, which is a very powerful statement? Persecution, maybe? This letter is kind of in that similar format to 2 John, where we were talking about the problems with persecution in the area, being under the Roman Empire, where Christianity was not always accepted and sometimes persecuted for it. So perhaps they were trying to fly under the radar. Of course, this is speculation. He could have been just being poetic, but it seems that he left things out on purpose, right? So he said things on purpose. He left things out on purpose. And this is what we try to get and try to glean from studying it. So nonetheless, we see why that they should be supported, right? Let's turn over to Luke 10. Luke 10, verses 1 through 12. Luke chapter 10, verses 1 through 12. And we'll read through it fairly quickly. But just take note and you go back and look over it again. Because, this is still instructions for us today, as we're going to see. We're going to put together some of this other stuff, which I think is very interesting, because it's a question I think I've come across many times in the church is, okay, what can I do? And we're going to answer that question here. So, Luke 10, verse 1, it says, and again, well, I'll let it speak for itself. It says, after these things, the Lord appointed 70 others also and sent them forth, 2 by 2, before his face into every city and place where he himself was about to go. Then he said to them, the harvest is truly great, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go your way. Behold, I send you out as lambs among wolves. Carry neither money bag, knapsack, nor sandals. Greet no one along the road, but whatever house you enter, first say, peace to this house. And if a son of peace is there, your peace will rest on it. If not, it will return to you. Remain in the same house, eating and drinking such things as they give, for the laborer is worthy of his wages. So do not go from house to house. So whatever city you enter, and they receive you, eat such things as they set before you. Heal the sick, say to them the kingdom of God is near, preach the gospel in other words. And whatever city that you enter, and they do not receive you, go out to the streets and say, the very dust of your city, which clings to us, we will wipe off against you. So they're not even going to take even a speck of dust. They clack in their shoes, leaving that dust behind. He says, nevertheless, to know this, that the kingdom of God has come near to you, and that in that day it's going to be more tolerable than for those in the day of Sodom than for that city. So the point being here is that when God, or when Christ at this time, again, God too, sent these people forth to preach the gospel, the truth, that those who receive them, were to first receive them, and I emphasize that word because we're going to talk about that a little more later. But there was this responsibility on the people to provide for them when they came into the city. So these men, going back to 3 John, that went forth, again, Paul's talking to Gaius, says, they went forth for his name's sake. So they're doing basically what we're seeing here in Luke 10. And it was this commission to go forth in the name of Christ and to preach the truth. And this is why they were to be received, why they were to receive them. As they were, again, obligated to do, as we're going to see in the next verse. And they were to support them, and they were to be loving and hospitable toward them. Now, also note in addition to this in verse 7 here, it says, taking nothing from the Gentiles. So more than likely, these Gentiles that they had previously been talking to and preaching to were not converted church members like Gaius and the others were. These Gentiles did not know, and they were not obligated in the same way to help out these men that were itinerant preachers going from place to place. Not only that, but these ministering men often wanted to make sure that the unconverted did not think that they were doing it for money. Okay, and even Paul did that sometimes. He didn't want money to get in the way because it was not worth their salvation. He didn't want to confuse his message with what he was doing. In 2 Corinthians 11, verses 7 through 9, Paul's talking here. 2 Corinthians 11, verses 7 through 9. He said, "Did I commit sin in humbling myself that you might be exalted? Because I preached the gospel of God to you free of charge." So Paul was willing to do without, right? He didn't want that to get in the way of his message. And so he humbled himself. He didn't take these things to himself. In fact, he says he took them from other places. In verse 8, he says, "I robbed other churches." Okay, obviously a metaphor for taking more from the other churches instead of getting it from them in Corinth. He says, "I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you." So it was completely within his rights, because like we just saw there in Luke 10, a laborer is worthy of his wages. Okay, when Christ sent out the 70, right, he told him that. And so it was due him in that sense for doing these things. But he says, "When I was present with you and in need, I was a burden to no one." So Paul, who was, by the way, very used to suffering and went through many things, that I'm sure that this was low on that list of things that he had gone through. But nonetheless, in that sense, he humbled himself. He did without when he needed things, just so he would not be a burden. He says, "For what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. In everything I kept myself from being burdensome to you, so I will keep myself." So it was worth it to him to make that sacrifice, just so what God and Christ wanted him to say would not be lost in that translation, that it would not be confused. That he came there and he says, "What I have I give to you. It's not silver and gold, but it's something of more value, even more precious. I'm going to give this to you, and then it won't be mixed in with any other wrong assumptions or thoughts that you might have of exactly why I'm doing this." Again, very common today that you look at these preachers on Sunday morning and the massive mansions and millions of dollars in book deals that they have. And you got to say, and people do say this, and this is why I'm bringing it up, because I hear so many people who are not religious, specifically, kind of synonymous to these Gentiles, saying, look, they're in it for the money. They're all about the money. That's what their motivation is. And so then obviously that message gets lost in this, what they see is the underlying reason for them doing it. So continuing in verse 8, 3 John verse 8, he says, "We therefore ought to receive such, that we may become fellow workers for the truth." All right. Again, the emphasis on the receive there. Now, this, what he's saying here in verse 8, is in antithesis to 2 John verse 10. Right? This is what we were talking about last week. "If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into your house." So we continue to see that John is, for all intents and purposes, addressing the same subject here in 3 John, just the flip side of the coin. So it's what to do in this situation if the person is not good or if they are good. He's saying, okay, yeah, we ought to receive such. It's a Christian's responsibility to be hospitable, right? 1 Peter 4:9 says, "Be hospitable to one another without grumbling." So do it with a good attitude, right? And again, it says, be hospitable. This is the thing about the New Testament. It doesn't necessarily go out and say, okay, here's the first commandment. It goes, I'm going to put all these things in here that you need to do. You should take them as a command, right? And again, it says, be hospitable. That is the way that he says we are to be. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. So when you go through the New Testament, there's actually more laws that we are to keep, more commands, more, of the way that we are to act. And so it actually becomes, in that respect, more burdensome than the Old Testament ever was, because now you have not only, again, and here's the thing, you're still keeping everything in the Old Testament, all the laws of it, but now you also have the spirit or the intent of the law. Anyway, he goes on, and here it is, somewhat innocuous in 1 Peter 4:9, be hospitable, right? Hebrews 13:2 says, don't forget to entertain strangers, because sometimes you will unwittingly entertain angels, just as Abraham did, whenever back in the, I'm going to have to guess, Genesis 12 or so, it's not in my notes, but, just 12, 13 to 15, right around there, that, again, he entertained them at that point, and I don't think he knew from the beginning that they were angels. I think he knew towards the end. But even if the strangers of verse 5, where it talks about, again, the strangers that are church people, but even if they had just not been church people, church members, it would still have been something that the Christian was committed to do. And that was to show love towards the alien, the foreigner, okay, this quote-unquote stranger within your gates. So even if that stranger didn't refer to church members, it was something that was incumbent on a church member to do, and that was to be hospitable. In fact, it's even a qualification of the elders. You can look at 1 Timothy 3:2 and Titus 1:8. It talks about this bishop, this overseer, this elder, who is supposed to be, among many other things, to be hospitable. All right? So it's a qualification. It's something necessary if you're going to move up to that next step. So, again, don't receive them, as 2 John is talking about, if they have a false doctrine. Right? So this is how he says, but if they are, you need to be hospitable. You need to receive them. So it goes hand in hand with 2 John, which deals largely with the wrong people in the congregation. Now we're dealing with how to treat the true brethren that come and visit your church. Because, again, this is a hint. It's leading towards what this letter is really about at its core. Now, but in this verse, just to finish it up, it talks about the fellow workers. Okay, so in being hospitable and helping them out, right, these strangers who come, the visiting prophets, elders, ministers, whatever they may be, it wasn't exactly clear what their exact job was, but they were coming there. And again, they're brothers. We're bound by this same spirit. We're all children of God. We're all related in that way, in a very important way, as sons of God, all to be members of the family of God together. But he's saying, okay, be hospitable, help them out, and become co-workers with them in preaching the gospel. These fellow workers, you are working with them basically hand in hand in the preaching of the gospel. So this is what I was alluding to before. Many have asked what they can do. Well, here is one very tangible way to aid those that have the job of going out and ministering. So here they are. They're coming to your area, right? What is it that you can do to facilitate them getting there and preparing a place for them to stay and saying, hey, we've got you covered. I definitely want you to come stay with us. We're going to, and don't worry about it. We're going to take care of you. We're going to feed you. And then we're going to send you forth, right? We're going to, if necessary, accompany you. And we're going to say, okay, here's the best way out of town. We're going to go, let me give you a hand carrying some of these goods that we gave you so that you can eat along the way, or so that you may have something that you can eat or chomp on, just in case you come across some of these other Gentiles and you're not going to take anything from them. Okay? He's saying that Again, John is saying that you are a fellow worker, a co-worker in the preaching of the gospel if you do this. This is how you can help, and this is how you can do your part. In Matthew 10, verses 40 and 41, Christ talks about this to a certain degree here, and it fits in perfectly with what we're talking about, and I think it's behooves us to go over there and have a look at it real quick. Matthew 10, verses 40 through 41. Matthew 10, verse 40 says, and this is Christ speaking, "He who receives you," okay, if you're going out, if you're ministering, going from place to place, "receives me." Okay, if you do this to them, God's saying, you're doing it to me, right? A principle that he used other times as well. "And he who receives me receives him who sent me." So not only me, okay, Christ is talking about this as flesh and blood, but he's now referring to God the Father who sent him, who he does the will of, who he doesn't even speak his own words. They are God the Father's words. So if you receive me, okay, if you receive them who go out, and this is what John's talking about, receive these people, you're receiving Christ. You're doing it for him, for his name's sake, and for God the Father. And then verse 41, he says, "He who receives a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. And he who receives a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man's reward." So he's saying here that if you receive them and you become this fellow worker with them, then you have a reward. Okay. Now, it's not exactly clear to me what that prophet's reward or what the reward of a prophet is, or the same thing for a righteous man. I mean, it could be that you receive this most valuable truth and knowledge and teaching, and they open up your mind and your heart in ways that it had not been before, which again is very valuable and more valuable than, money, goods, materialism, stuff, blessings in that way. Or it could mean that in the future, the reward of the prophet based on his works, that you are in line for that. Because we look up to these people and we say, oh, I want to be the minister. I want to be the prophet. I want to be the evangelist or the apostle that goes around and tells everybody what to do. And again, I think a lot of that's based on pride and ego. But God gives everyone their talents, okay, in specificity as well as quantity. And we're not all the same. And that's why we don't judge one another. You do with what God has given you, okay? And you work it. And if by chance they have 5 talents and you have 5 talents and y'all both increase them 5, then yes, you are going to be rewarded in the same way that the prophet was rewarded. Again, it's not clear, but he's just saying, don't think that it goes unnoticed. All right? If you receive them and if you work with them, you're going to receive a reward just like them. And like the prophet or like the righteous man. Because we're both instrumental in accomplishing the work of God. Again, not everybody can be the fingers. Okay? Some people have to be the eyes. Okay? So we work in concert with one another. And if you think I'm belaboring the point a little bit, it's because this is what you can do as a member of the Church of God to help with the preaching of the gospel. It's one of the tangible examples that God gives in the Bible. And you cannot diminish your part in it because it takes both parts. They're both necessary to accomplish what it is that God wants to be accomplished. And he's using both of you in the way that he deems right, the way that he wants to use. He's got all these moving gears, and he's got everybody in the place that they go, and you can't remove one and expect the whole machine to work correctly without having to you compensate for the things that somebody thinks that they, shouldn't be doing or should be doing. And they remove themselves. So again, don't think of yourself more highly than you should. Do the job that you've been given. Help out where you can help out. It's important to do. So there we go. We have gone through now the beginning and the middle, and now we're coming now towards the culmination of the reason that John wrote this letter. So again, just by way of recap, he tells Gaius, you have the truth and love, and others in the congregation. He says that you no doubt will do faithfully for the brethren and strangers that sit there. You will set the good example in this. All right. And now we come to verse 9. And he says, I wrote to the church, but Diotrophies, now the third name, the third person in this letter, who loves to have preeminence among them, does not receive us. All right, so now we understand the importance of this word, receive, of this action that reflects the way that they think. Okay, and now we're getting to, Gaius did, and the members there do receive, and the Christian is supposed to receive because it's receiving Christ and the Father and all that goes with that. But now Diotrophies does not. So this is the core issue and the reason that John had to write the letter. And he took the occasion of Diotrophies' actions to reinforce how a Christian should act towards visiting ministers and members. But the impetus for the epistle was to attend to Diotrophies and his out-of-control behavior. So he wrote to the church, it seems previously to John, and John sounds like he tried to schedule a trip, but Diotrophies either was, in charge, or he was the one that was making these unilateral decisions, or he had assumed command, as it were, and he denied him because he loved to have the preeminence. So it was unclear exactly what his position was, whether he was put in charge or whether he assumed command. So now it's kind of unclear whether he loved his position of authority or because of this, he had this preeminence. This preeminence in terms of the Greek just means to be fond of being first. It implies being ambitious of distinction, wanting the accolades, as it were. So whether he loved his position of authority too much, or because of his preeminence, this attitude that he had, that he just took over and started making decisions. So the prevailing understanding is that he was actually an elder in the area, and he just didn't agree with John, the apostle of Christ, who saw him and did all these things and whom Jesus loved. And the other thing, obviously, it was he didn't understand. I don't think he had the heart to live by Christ's words, right? What did Christ say? He who is greatest among you shall be your servant. So this man, Diotrophies, doesn't appear to know God, doesn't appear to know Jesus, doesn't appear to know the Word of God, or at the very least, is willing to live by them. So, of course, he did not receive us. He did not receive John and them that were being sent there. So it's presumptuous of him to say that John should not be there. Now we can better understand why John needed to write the letter and why he did it in the way that he did. Diotrophies was displaying this attitude that was unbecoming of a minister. So we previously cited the qualifications, right, of an elder. And the one that we emphasized was being hospitable. And here he is doing the exact opposite. He was rebellious. He didn't want to allow these preachers into, quote unquote, his congregation. And I'm guessing it sounds like Diotrophies had some doctrinal differences with those that were going to speak the truth in his area. And of course, that's never going to sit well with false ministers either. So now John has to deal with this arrogant, unchristian, heretical man that's literally causing division in the church. We also see why John now started off the epistle with the words about walking and talking in the truth, walking in the truth, speaking the truth, and acting in love. This was the solution to what Diotrophies was doing. So verse 10, he says, therefore, this is John speaking, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds, which he does, prating against us with malicious words. Not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. So therefore, he says, okay, because of what was said before, he's now going to say the following. He says, if I come, right? And again, verse 14 says, he hopes to come soon. He says, I will call to mind his actions. They were going to be remembered. There's going to be an accounting of them at that time. Again, if you want, you can go ahead and put 1 Corinthians 3:13 through 15 in your notes. And it says that everyone's work is going to become clear for the day, meaning the end time, the judgment is going to declare it, and you're going to be revealed by fire. So if you build a good work, it's going to last. If you build one like Diotrophies, it's going to suffer loss and go through the fire. So he says, I'm going to call to mind his actions. And we're going to see why that's all he, quote unquote, needs to do at this point in time. He's not even going to go through here and say, you need to be disfellowship. Y'all need to kick him out. Y'all need to, do this and that. No, he says, no, when I come, I'm going to call to mind these actions, right? Whether to him or in front of the congregation, we'll find out at that time. Because he was prating against us. Again, a word I don't think we use very often. It gets used less and less. It was one of the words that maybe they used around the 1900s or the 1600s or whatever. But it's this use of silly or idle or trifling and empty talk. It's meaningless words. But they were nonetheless malicious words. They were evil words. He was trying to hurt John with these words. And he wasn't content with just the gossiping. Okay, he wasn't content with that. He himself did not receive the brethren. So he was not being hospitable, as an elder definitely should have been, and members are supposed to be. But he was setting himself up as this authority figure that he decides that he doesn't need or want any other outside church members coming in and preaching. And this was no doubt because it was a challenge to the false doctrines that he held and the way he saw things and the way that he wanted to teach. So there seemed to be this acrimony between him and John in that way. Of course, it was him in his mind, not John in his. John was a holder of the truth, a seeker of the truth, holding fast to that. But Diotrophies went so far as to forbid those who wanted to be hospitable and wanted to receive the brethren in that way, these traveling men into the area. He forbid them to do that. He says, no, you can't be godly. You can't do what you're supposed to do, what we've been instructed to do. And he went so far as to put them out of the church. So he's going to divide up the church without true cause. I mean, he has his reasons for doing it, which are not altruistic. So this is, one way I think to make sure that the numbers of those who stand for the truth and go against you, that they're not going to grow to this unwieldy amount. So Diotrophies can still remain in control and continue to tell everybody what to do. And there's not going to be this uprising because he's putting them all out. And he's making it very clear that if you stand against him, this is what's going to happen. So in this, he's putting them out of the church. It seems very clear that he is indeed an elder, and he was the one that was in charge of the congregation. But he's using that authority that he had. And again, don't get me wrong, the minister has the authority to not let people speak in his church. And he's supposed to do that in the view and light of 2 John, those who are false ministers. But Diotrophies is doing this in terms of true ministers. Okay? He did not want them coming in and speaking different to the lies and falsehoods that he's been telling. So this guy is an absolute piece of work, and John is having to deal with him in this letter. And it's interesting, too, here, that now as we look at a document that's a little over 1,900 years old, it seems, how relevant it is still today. You know, I just heard recently that the same exact type of thing happened where members were okayed to go. I mean, they called ahead and said, hey, can we come to your congregation? Which, again, was a different organization, one that they had formerly been a part of. And they show up, and then one of the guys there says, you know, after they'd already gone there, after they'd been okay to go there, he got rid of them. He says, no, you guys attend somewhere else. You can't be here. Right? You know, there is no love there for the brethren. There is no unity. You know, they're dividing things up with these, you know, worldly legal boundaries and saying, no, you're in this other organization. You can't be in ours. But, you know, the Bible's very clear that there's one church, one doctrine. And yet they're still doing it. So, you know, what needs to happen? Well, again, this application of 3 John would go a long ways towards fixing that. If people had the ear to hear and the will to do what was right. So now we come to more or less the conclusion of the matter here in 3 John in verse 11. He says, beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. He who does good is of God, but he who does evil has not seen God. So John, who to me comes across as a very gentle and loving man / apostle, doesn't pull any punches here. You know, you can look at this and you could almost be forgiven for viewing it just as a standalone type of proverb, but it's really a condemnation of what Diotrophies is doing here. And he says, do not imitate what is evil. You know, this word for imitate means to mimic or mime. And the King James Version's always translating it as followers. And even within the New King James, 2 out of 7 times it's translated as followers, but all the other times as imitate. Again, like I said, if you look at the Greek, you go, oh, yeah, that word means mimic or mime. And so John here is saying, do not follow this man. And especially do not do what he is doing. Right? What did Paul say in 1 Corinthians 11:1? He says, imitate me just as I imitate Christ. Or he says, follow me as I follow Christ. All right? This man who does evil, right? This is what Diotrophies is doing, has not seen God. Right? He is not, again, if you look at 1 John 3:10, you know, John's also writing there. He says this is the difference between children of God and children of the devil and how they're manifest. Whoever doesn't practice righteousness is not of God, nor is he who does not love his brother. So he wasn't practicing, you know, the way of life that he should have been. He was not showing love for his brother. He was not receiving them. So yes, he was a child of the devil. He was evil. He was not, you know, doing what God said to do. So Gaius is doing what was right up to this point, and John's saying, don't do what Diotrophies is doing. And now he introduces this next person, the last person, who has a good reputation that they should follow. In 3 John 1, verse 12, he says, Demetrius has a good testimony from all, and from the truth itself. And we also bear witness, and you know that our testimony is true. So not much is known about Demetrius outside of this verse. There's another one mentioned in Acts 19:24, but he's a pagan silversmith that caused trouble for Paul. So it's not the same one. But what we see here is that Demetrius has a good testimony from all. So it's been witnessed that this is the case. In other words, that this is a man that you can follow. And note that all have seen this attribute in Demetrius. All. So John then makes a point that he also bears witness of the fact. So this is something that Demetrius was a man that they already knew. And he had this good reputation. And he was known in John's area. But more importantly, in Gaius's congregation, they knew him. So me reading between the lines here and trying to put two and two together, John is telling them to follow Demetrius and not Diotrophies. So this is why John did not have to disfellowship or do anything like that to Diotrophies, but simply said in so many words that he's going to remind him of how he acted next time he is there. And so we have then John saying in the previous verse, do not imitate what is evil, do not follow, in other words, what is evil, but follow what is good. Imitate what is good. So do not follow Diotrophies, but here we have Demetrius with a good testimony. Follow him, because you know that our testimony is true, and John was known for being truth, for the truth and being truthful. And again, what a great testimony that is of John. Can you imagine being known for always, everything that you said is true? Most don't even know, like we were talking about before, what the truth is, much less being able to recite it or do it. So then finally, we have the wrap up and the final greetings in verses 13 and 14. He had a lot to write to them. I said, I do not wish to write to you, everything with pen and ink, which is similar to the ending of 2 John. And it sounds like there was too many things to write, like texting. Sometimes you say, oh, okay, this is just too much to say. I'm just going to call them. Or, in their case, go there and see them face to face. And perhaps some of it was too sensitive for the times and could have been trouble for the local congregation had it gotten into the wrong hands, like we talked about before. And then he says, but I hope to see you shortly, and we shall speak face to face. Peace to you, our friends. Greet you. Greet the friends by name. So again, he hopes to see them shortly. His desire was to get there quickly, not only because of the problems, but because of his love for them and his willingness to be with his quote-unquote children and to serve them. So what we see here in this short epistle is that John sets up this comparison and contrast between Gaius and Demetrius and Diotrophies. Gaius and Demetrius being the good ones that you emulate, and Diotrophies is the one that you don't follow. So, we have this love, truth, serving attitude, good reputation on one hand, and you see that Diotrophies is focused on himself and not on others. He doesn't accept John in his position as apostle. He's the one who's John seemingly physically established his congregation, which is, again, what the connotation of my children means. He does not speak the truth, but lies. This is Diotrophies still. He does not live by the word of God. He's not loving or unifying, but rather divisive. Right? So we today can take heart that what we are going through in the church today, it's not new. And it's always been, for at least the last 2,000 years. And as long as Satan's been around, he's going to be causing and stirring up trouble. But we have here in 3 John that he's giving us a template here, and as well as 2 John, for moving forward. It gives us direction and shows us how to handle these types of issues that are going on right now. And it's inspiration if we live by these ways, and we can take encouragement from it. And we can have the confidence to know that with God's help, we can do what we're supposed to do.